After I left the Bureau myself and went to Florida State University, I recalculated the index every 10 years and was assisted by a student named E. Walter Terry.
Charlie Nam supervised Walt Terry's doctoral dissertation at Florida State half a century ago. Available census data on occupations in the United States already had changed dramatically. In the 1970s, for the first time, the Census Bureau made available large samples of individual responses about a respondent's occupation, education, income, sex, age, race, and a host of other characteristics. While personal identifying information was carefully removed from such records to protect anonymity of respondents, you could now aggregate data into customized categories of your own choosing and then do statistical analysis based on these individual responses rather than relying only on printed tabulations released by the Bureau. These census public use samples differed greatly from resources scholars enjoy today. Terry faced more than 60 large reels of magnetic tape containing the 1960 and 1970 1 in 100 sample of census respondents. He had to select his dissertation data from among 5 million records, hierarchically arranged for individuals within households. Terry wrote his own Fortran programs to extract data over a period of several months for 1960 and 1970 census respondents with occupation codes that could be matched from these tapes. Then he compared the 1960 and 1970 distributions to see how occupations and the people in them had shifted over time. While he did observe considerable stability in the overall distribution of occupational status, he concluded that, quote, studies of intergenerational mobility should allow for the possibility of different occupational orderings over time, unquote. Terry's analysis introduced some new angles in the evolution of the NAM Powers Index. Originally, NAM calculated the index for households based on the occupation and education of the chief income earner or household head. Strictly speaking, his original units of analysis were households, not individuals, unless they formed a household by themselves. The idea that everyone in a household shares a certain level of living has some intrinsic appeal, as well as conforming to the limited data available to Charlie when he started this work in the 1960s. Even then, however, he made concessions to the complexities of life in households and counted total family income if the household included multiple earners, rather than just the income of the chief income earner. By the end of the 1970s, that focus on households as units of analysis disappeared from the work of Terry and others on the research team. Data became available for individual respondents in the census public use samples. Every individual had earned income during the year before a census was considered separately, not only in terms of their reported education, but also their own occupation and their personal earnings from work, rather than counting all income from any sources. As so often is the case today, attention to social molecules like households or families has shifted in most analysis to concentrate on individual persons as the atoms that make up a society. This raised a key conceptual issue for Nam and his colleagues. At what point should one consider whether occupations form different kinds of status hierarchies for different kinds of people? Important distinctions in all societies, such as age, race, or sex, came immediately to mind. In 1982, Mary Powers edited a special collection of articles from a symposium of the American Academy for the Advancement of Science that dealt with measures of socioeconomic status. In her introduction, she pointed out that scores are determined by the relative education and income levels of detailed occupations. As such, they are the property of occupations. Characteristics such as age, sex, and race apply to individuals, not to occupations, and Powers insisted that such individual characteristics should remain separate correlates of socioeconomic status rather than components of the status measure itself. Already in 1978, Powers and Joan Holmberg had been advocating for using all persons in the labor force as the reference population rather than just men or household heads. Another of the chapters in Powers' edited AAAS volume came from two Canadian researchers, Monica Boyd and Hugh McRoberts, with a focus on how to compare socioeconomic status of men and women. They pointed out that rating the status of an occupation based only on the men in those jobs, as had been done in most earlier research, was problematic if you tried to assign the same status ranking to women in such occupations. Boyd and McRoberts, like Powers, recommended that the entire experienced labor force, not only men, should be the reference population for ranking occupational categories.
The entry of women into the labor force in the 1970s and 80s stimulated considerable discussion in the 80s about whether the scores should be calculated separately for men and then separately for women, or if the scores should be calculated for the total sum of men and women combined in any occupational title group. Today, the scores are primarily calculated for both men and women combined.
Once occupations were scored on this basis, not only the number of workers in each occupation, but also the social composition of the occupation, ages, sexes, races, and so on, could be studied as correlates of higher or lower scores for different occupations. When Monica Boyd finished her PhD at Duke University and started her first academic position at Carleton University in Ottawa in 1970, Charles Namm and Mary Powers already had published several of the articles that established their index of socioeconomic status for ranking both occupational categories and the individuals pursuing these occupations. Over the next 2 decades, as the Namm-Powers Index gained further traction and attention among scholars, Boyd conducted social research in both Canada and the United States. She served on the board of directors of the Population Association of America and as president of the Canadian Population Society during the 1980s. Then in 1992, she accepted the Claude and Mildred Pepper Professor Endowed Chair position at Florida State University and connected directly to the research team Charlie Namm had assembled there.
Between 1992 and 2000, I was a professor in the sociology department and in the Center for Population Studies at Florida State University. At Florida State, our offices were on the same floor, and we saw each other almost daily. This was conducive to discussions about common interests, including occupational scales, and those discussions led to our first collaboration, which used data from the 2000 Census of Population.
In the mid-1990s, this group reached its zenith, with Mary Powers still participating from Fordham University, and Namm, Boyd, Walt Terry, and others collaborating in Tallahassee. Although Walt Terry died tragically in 1997, this work culminated in the development of what is now known as the Namm-Powers-Boyd, or NPB Index, of socioeconomic status, first calculated in its present form for results for the 1990 census.
Walt Terry passed away not long after he worked with me on the project, and I discussed the index with Monica Boyd. Monica had been an FSU faculty member who had shifted to the University of Toronto. She was interested in the index as I developed it, and so she collaborated with me on iterations of the index, which continue to this day. Well, with Monica in Toronto and me in Tallahassee, it wasn't easy to collaborate, but the fact is that we did engage in discussions about the index from time to time, both in terms of deciding whether or not to modify the methods of calculating it, as well as finding the data to do the calculations.
By the time the Nam-Powers-Boyd team analyzed results of the 2000 census, Monica Boyd had left FSU for the University of Toronto, but remained integrally involved in the analysis, taking over much of the actual derivation of scores. She subsequently developed parallel SES scores for Canada using the same methodology.
Our collaboration benefited from the release of census data in digital format to the public, beginning with the 1960 public use files. By the time that we were working on the 2000 census files, we were able to customize our measures of education and earnings, and we were able to better define our population of interest, which was the civilian workforce. The creation of Wi-Fi and other electronic modes of communication meant that we could produce new occupational scores easily, even when we were no longer at Florida State. I left for the University of Toronto in 2000, and Charlie eventually retired, although he often was around. But for example, we were able to update the 2000 occupational scores around 2010 using data from several years of the American Community Survey, and we were able to do that although both of us were at different places.
Another fundamental shift in the character of the NPB Index of Socioeconomic Status took place during that final decade of the 20th century. A research team led by Stephen Ruggles at the University of Minnesota won support from the National Institutes of Health and other sponsors for a project creating public use microdata samples of individuals in each decennial census and making these sample datasets available free of charge to any researcher who registers at the IPUMS website.
One major milestone occurred with 2000 scores, which were produced from the 2000 census of population. The scores relied on the educational levels and the earnings of individuals specific to each occupational title. This continues in our later calculations using later censuses. IPUMS, the Minnesota repository of data from the census and other surveys produced in the United States, has used this procedure to calculate occupational scores for earlier censuses.
No one needs to work with 50 or 60 reels of magnetic tape today or write their own computer code to extract information for an original analysis. As the IPUMS team expanded the project over following decades, IPUMS public use samples emerged from one historical census after another, reaching back through the entire century and even back into the 1800s. When I reviewed the first proposal to the National Institutes of Health to create these public IPUMS samples, in my enthusiasm for the project, I predicted that they would become the demographic equivalent of the Human Genome Project, charting the outlines of the development of society in the United States. Scholarly awareness of Charlie Nam's Index of Socioeconomic Status had spread by the end of the century to the extent that when IPUMS analysts assembled each of their public use microdata samples from different censuses, they not only included information about the educational attainment, earned income, and detailed occupational status of individual respondents. They actually replicated index calculations proposed by Nam, Powers, Boyd, and their colleagues. These pre-calculated values appear as measured characteristics of IPUMS respondents.
The finished product rests on the following calculations. First, one calculates the median educational levels of individuals in each occupational title. We do the same for earnings, taking into account that the earnings are for the year previous to the census. We then compute the percentile distribution for each variable, weighted by the number of individuals in the ith specific occupational title group. We combine these distributions and divide by 2. So the index is a weighted composite of the percentile distributions for each occupational title divided by 2.
IPUMS public use samples include 2 different variables, one based on the older 1950 list of occupations and another based on the newer 1990 census classification of occupational categories. But one caveat applies to these IPUMS variables. NPB OSS 50 or NPB OSS 90 scores only rank order the occupation categories by education and income, and then average the shares of the labor force below each occupation's median education and income. They are only scores for occupational categories, so that all workers with the same occupation code get the same index score. The second stage of the original NAM-Powers-Boyd index, combining these underlying median occupation scores with separate scores for each individual reflecting personal income and years of schooling, so that each individual within an occupation gets a slightly different final score, are left to researchers to complete themselves. Today, when researchers download their own IPUMS extracts of data from historical censuses and now also from the annual American Community Survey results, they can include the pre-calculated NPB Index of Socioeconomic Status as one characteristic of occupations, but need to remember that it is a group measure and does not vary for individual respondents within occupation groups. Of course, this modern convenience of pre-calculated measures of socioeconomic status in IPUMS samples means that to some extent, earlier versions of the index have fallen by the wayside. The IPUMS team has used the most contemporary modern version of the NPB calculations to create harmonized versions of the index retrospectively for historical census enumerations. These IPUMS variables always include all persons in the experienced civilian labor force, not just men or chief income earners. The group score for each occupation reflects the occupations of the experienced civilian labor force as of 1950 for the NPB OSS 50 variable, and as of 1990 for the NPB OSS 90 variable. The most challenging feature of creating these harmonized NPB index scores across different census counts has been the constant evolution of the list of different occupations as the labor force of the United States has shifted and become more complex with each passing decade. Some occupations wither or even disappear, while others appear and challenge our system of classifying them. NPB scores always assign a person's status based on the position of that person's occupation within the labor force as of the reference year, allowing at least limited comparison of the changing relative status of occupations over time. These NPB index values included in IPUMS public use microdata samples make it possible for any economist, historian, sociologist, journalist, or other interested scholar to conduct their own original investigations of how other dimensions of people's lives impact the status of their occupation, and perhaps to explore possible refinements and extensions of the index itself as a tool for understanding the complex labor force of the United States. Thanks to this scholarly collaboration between Charles Nam, Monica Boyd, Mary Powers, and their colleagues, and particularly the inclusion of the NPB index in IPUMS public use samples, unprecedented opportunities continue to emerge for creative and important new insights into the fundamental link between the jobs we do and other aspects of our life chances and the shape of American society.